welcome to this lecture sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 online MAs, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you are interested in learning more about us, please visit us at iwp.edu. We would like to thank all of our supporters who make our IWP events program possible. To support the work of IWP, please visit iwp.edu/donate. Today's lecture is sponsored by IWP's Center for Intermaritime Studies. We will be hearing from Jacob Spencer on his lecture titled Svalbard, a History and Analysis of NATO's Potential Arctic Frontier Fortress. Jacob Spencer is a first-year student of Strategic Intelligence Studies at IWP. He studied history at the University of Arkansas and at Monticello and spent 9 months teaching English as a foreign language in Uzbekistan. He's fluent in the Russian language and is pursuing a career as an expert on Russian and post-Soviet affairs. Throughout the meeting, please feel free to add any questions into the Q&A function in the meeting window, and if time permits, we'll address this at the conclusion of the lecture. With that, please join me in welcoming Jacob Spencer.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Philip. So yes, my name is Jacob Spencer. Philip did a fine job of introducing me. Just a little bit else about myself and about the lecture here. So this topic I covered for one of my first courses at IWP on geography and strategy. So today I'm going to be talking, of course, about Svalbard, about the Arctic more broadly, and a lot about, in particular, geography and how geography influences the strategic importance of the Svalbard Archipelago. I do anticipate there will be time for questions at the end. I'll try to get through this relatively quickly and hopefully have a nice little discussion to round it all out for us today. So with that established, let me get started. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to use for this lecture. So let me pull it up here. Give me just one moment. Okay. So starting out, what I'm going to cover, first of all, is beginning. Okay. So what I'm going to be covering, first of all, today is the history of Svalbard, particularly as it relates to geopolitics in the Arctic. This topic has a pretty heavy focus, or this lecture rather, has a pretty heavy emphasis on Russia and Russia's specific interests and activities in the Arctic and in Svalbard. As I mentioned earlier, I'll talk about the geography of Svalbard and why that's significant, Russia's presence in the Arctic, especially their military presence, and then I'll have an analysis and conclusions section at the end. So to start us off, this is a map depicting the location of Svalbard. As you can see, it's roughly 600 miles north of mainland Norway and roughly the same distance from mainland Russia as well. We've got Greenland to the west. We've got Franz Josef Land right here, a collection of Russian-owned islands to the northeast, and the Novaya Zemlya also to the east of Svalbard. As you can see, it is quite deep within the Arctic Circle, and it sits in a good sort of middle ground between Greenland and Russia and the Russian side of the Arctic. I wanted to start off with this introduction quote, which I think very succinctly summarizes a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today and why the topic of Svalbard interested me. So quickly read through this. Svalbard's ambiguous status as both fully Norwegian and yet completely open to the interests of 46 other nations, including the United States and Russia, make it a ripe target for Russian aggression. The addition of rich oil reserves in the seabed around Svalbard and the ability to exploit internal NATO division over the extent of Norwegian control pushes the potential for conflict even further. This comes from an article from 2018 by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Zimmerman, which the citation I have right here. And if anybody would like the citation for this article afterwards, you can make that request in the Q&A. I'll be happy to provide it. This article, again, provided a lot of inspiration for the talk today, and I recommend it as a good source if you want more info on this topic. So a little bit about the history of Svalbard. One of the topics that quote touched on is the diplomatic ambiguity of the archipelago. So it is subject to a 1920 treaty, the Spitsbergen or Svalbard Treaty. Under that treaty's Article 1, Norway has, quote, full and absolute sovereignty over the archipelago. However, the citizens of that treaty have equal commercial rights as regions in Svalbard, and there is a visa-free entry regime for the citizens of that of the signatories of that treaty. Now, so far, the country that has by far exploited those commercial rights and privileges the most is Russia, which we will talk about here in a moment. So, Russia specifically, one of the important topics when talking about Svalbard and Russia's activity there relates to this company Arctic Ugol, which literally translates as Arctic Coal. It's a state-owned Russian mining company. It was established by the Soviet Union back in the 1930s. But Arctic continues to operate today at a much smaller level than it used to. In the 1970s, Arctic Ugol, for example, employed 1,000 people on Svalbard, specifically on the main island of Spitsbergen, which I can quickly bring back here. So you've got this main island right here in Svalbard, and then the rest of them are uninhabited. But right here, you have large permanent settlements, including the Russian Arctic Ugol coal mining settlements. One important point that I want to establish here is that in 1975, the Soviet Union established a military colony. It was a temporary one on Svalbard, which directly violated Article 9 of the 1920 Spitsbergen Treaty, which forbids the establishment of, quote, fortifications, end quote, which may be used for, quote, warlike purposes. There's a well-established history there of the Russians, previously the Soviets, engaging in illegal activities in the Arctic. I'm not sure that comes as much of a surprise to most people, but in this particular instance, there's no exception to that when it comes to Svalbard, essentially. Now, since the Cold War, Russia has not necessarily ceased to engage in, if not entirely illegal activities, nevertheless questionable ones. In 2007, for example, Artur Chilingarov, who used to be a member of the Russian State Duma, he died, I believe, last year. He led an expedition to the Lomonosov Ridge. I'll have a map here in the next slide to illustrate this. But essentially what he did was he led the expedition to the Lomonosov Ridge in the Arctic Ocean, and he dropped a titanium canister, which had the Russian flag, to the seabed of the ridge, which symbolically served to claim a large swath of the Arctic for Russia. In 2023, not long ago at all, Arctic Ugol, the coal mining company, state-owned Russian coal mining company on Svalbard, they flew the flag of the DNR, the Russian abbreviation, that's the Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian separatist movement. They flew the flag of the DNR for Victory Day celebrations, May 9th, the day of on which Russians and other people in post-Soviet countries celebrate the victory over Nazi Germany. It's arguably one of, if not perhaps the most important holiday for many people in the post-Soviet sphere. Also, the same year, two additional points on here I want to point out. The the general director of Arctic Ugol, Dmitry Negrutsa, he declared that part of Arctic Ugol's research included the study of Russian activities in Svalbard as a, quote, unique discipline. He gave this quote in an interview with a Russian Arctic media outlet, a Russia-based media outlet with a focus on topics relating to the Arctic. The reason I put this point on here is that this language that Negrutsa used about including the study of Russians on Svalbard as a unique discipline, it is somewhat reminiscent of a lot of the language that Russia often uses to describe the Russian diaspora abroad, right? So, for example, with Ukraine is probably the most high-profile example of this. A large part of Russia's justification for going into Ukraine is that you've got large population of ethnic Russians, particularly in east and in the south of Ukraine. Russia has undertaken a massive effort to establish that the history of ethnic Russians and culturally Russian people in Ukraine is very long and it's very deep-rooted, and that's one of the justifications that they have for going into Ukraine to try and liberate or protect ethnic Russians in the region from alleged abuses by Ukrainian authorities, which leads me then to the next point that I have on this list here, which is the same year, 2023, Natalia Belisheva, who leads this Department of Medicine Biological Research at a Russian research center in the Arctic, claimed with no evidence that the United States was establishing a biological weapons research site on Bear Island with support from the Norwegian government. Bear Island, by the way, is technically part of the Svalbard Archipelago. There is actually a human presence on Bear Island for a small meteorological station. But I suppose the Russians have evidence that while simultaneously measuring weather reports and temperature readings, we're also developing, dirty bombs and all that kind of stuff, which, again, it's a little bit ridiculous, but it is also reminiscent of the kind of language that the Russians have used against, most notably against the Ukrainians, right? It's a common conspiracy theory. Many pro-Russian forces hold that the United States, with Ukrainian support, is developing biological weapons at research sites in Ukraine. So certain parallels that we're seeing here, at least in terms of the information operations. So this is the map of the Lomonosov Ridge relating to the first point that I had on here about the State Duma member Chilingarov, who dropped the titanium canister with the Russian flag. So if we look here, if he drops the canister in the ridge, symbolically would claim everything south of the Lomonosov Ridge, which obviously includes large swaths of Arctic Russia, but also includes much of, and obviously it's a little bit ambiguous, potentially all of Greenland, as well as unambiguously all of Svalbard, which we see down here just north of Norway. Now, a little bit about Russia's military presence in the Arctic. So in 2014, not long after Russia annexed Crimea and Ukraine, they established the Nagorskaya Air Base, Aviabaza Air Base in Franz Josef Land, which is this, as a reminder, this collection, small archipelago of islands here just east of Svalbard. They established an air base there, which is home to a small contingent of stealth bombers. Additionally, in 2022, Russia released a new maritime doctrine. I have gone looking for a more recent, updated version of this. I have not found one. If anyone is aware of one, I'd be more than happy to see it if you would send it over. But this was nevertheless after the invasion of Ukraine, right? I think this was in the summer of 2022 when they released the maritime doctrine for the year. They called for, and this is another direct quote from the text, the diversification and mobilization of maritime activities in the archipelagos of Spitsbergen, which refers to Svalbard, Franz Joseph Land, which we discussed just a moment ago, Novaya Zemlya, and Wrangel Island. Now, quite vague language there, I think probably deliberately so. But a couple of questions that immediately raised for me. First of all, what does diversification and mobilization entail? Does that, and sort of related to that, what do maritime activities include? Do those include military activities? There is lots of information in the doctrine about scientific research and all kinds of climate initiatives and those kinds of things. However, given that Russia already has established military presences on Franz Joseph Land, as well as, I believe, on Novaya Zemlya, there is some suggestion here, again, particularly made possible through the ambiguity of the language that they're using, that this could include military activities and military diversification and mobilization. So a map here to show as well, this is specifically Russian military presence in the Arctic. So the airbase that I mentioned earlier, Nagorskaya, located right here in Franz Joseph Land, as you can see, many of Russia's main Arctic bases kind of ring around all along the northern coast of mainland Russia. However, they do have major bases on several Arctic islands, including the ones mentioned in the 2022 Naval Maritime Doctrine, Franz Joseph Land right here, east of Svalbard, Novaya Zemlya, this larger island here, and then we had Wrangel Island up here as well. A quick note that I wanted to add on here related to climate change and geography. Again, as geography is a major point of this lecture. So the waters south of Svalbard, and actually I have a quick, I want to quickly jump out of here and show a map that includes military bases, not just from Russia, but from NATO members as well, the United States, Canada, Iceland, Denmark, and Norway. So as we can see, the waters up here just north, or I'm sorry, just south of Svalbard, there's fairly ample NATO presence that could potentially reach out into this region of the Arctic Ocean. Obviously, you have lots of NATO bases, air bases, naval bases down in northern Norway. More distant, of course, you've also got Keflavik Air Base in Iceland, as well as several bases up in Greenland, although primarily on the, or rather entirely on the western coast. There is, however, this notable gap here up in the north, north of Svalbard, in the northern part of the Arctic Ocean. Turning to this. So the thing about this is that the waters north of Svalbard remain covered in ice, usually year-round. So the region remains impassable for most vessels. Of course, icebreakers could potentially get through certain parts of the area, but certainly no large-scale military or commercial maritime activity can go on up there currently. However, as global temperatures increase, Arctic ice coverage is going to recede, and the waters north of Svalbard will become open to maritime passage. This is a fairly major topic today, of course, in particular with regards to trade and commerce. The idea that as the Arctic melts, as more water, or rather as the ice coverage recedes, shrinks in the north, you could have new Arctic passages open up for trade. That, of course, is a valid point. But also, it's worth keeping in mind that as tensions particularly increase between Russia and NATO, the Arctic is becoming increasingly a site for military tension and possible military confrontation between two blocs. For now, there is not an immediate threat of conflict breaking out by any means in the Arctic. However, this is something that in the longer term strategic outlook will need to be taken into account. The shrinking of Arctic ice caps and the opening up of new waterways in the north. The last thing that I want to put on here, there was a study from 2024, which, and of course, I have citations for all of these. They don't appear in the slideshow mode, but if anybody has questions or is interested in citations, feel free to leave a comment and I can send those over, send them to Philip or put them in the chat for anyone who's interested. A 2024 study suggested that the Arctic at large could be entirely ice-free during summer months as early as 2035. Make of that what you will. Of course, projections can certainly be incorrect. That could be more likely that projection is quite liberal in its interpretation of how much ice would melt, so it could be further out in the future. But nevertheless, it is a future that we're likely heading towards, and therefore NATO, the West, will need to take that into account when considering their strategy for the Arctic. And again, if we come back here, Svalbard is well positioned to serve as something of a guardian or a sentry over the northern part of the Arctic Ocean. So if Russian vessels, for example, are trying to pass out of the Barents Sea and out into the Arctic or into the Atlantic, trying to swing south of Svalbard, they would be exposing themselves to NATO bases in northern Norway. However, if Svalbard is unprotected and the eastern, especially northeastern coast of Greenland is also unprotected, there's no NATO presence up there, then Russian vessels, specifically military vessels, could, in the event of a conflict, go around the north of Svalbard and they would be able to pass with relative impunity through that region. So now some sort of summary and analysis of some of the things that I've talked about so far. The first thing, I've broken this up into two sections. One regarding how Russia can use Svalbard as a site for information and gray zone operations, as well as a way of degrading NATO's unity, and then also some ways in which Svalbard could be an asset for NATO itself. So with regards to the Russian, potential Russian exploitation of Svalbard, I want to point out that Arctic Ugal, the state-owned coal mining company on Svalbard, Russian coal mining company there, it's relatively small these days. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1970s, 60s, it was much larger. The Soviet Union had a much greater presence there. Russia maintains a small presence on Svalbard, despite the fact that it's not particularly economically valuable with regards to coal mining. Now, there are, of course, oil reserves in the waters around Svalbard that could become interesting to the Russians in the future. But what I think is going on with Arctic Ugal, as we saw earlier with the quotes from the general director, for example, of Arctic Ugal and the State Duma member who dropped the canister down into the Lomonosov Ridge, it seems that Russia is maintaining a presence in there to, at the very least, give them an easy excuse to justify actions to protect, in quotes, ethnic Russians. This ties back into what I was mentioning earlier, common Russian disinformation campaign that they've used against Georgia, that they've used against Ukraine and Chechnya and the Baltic states and so on and so forth. So that's the first point I want to make here, is that the Russians can very easily use Svalbard as a site and as a tool for information operations to discredit Norway and NATO. We saw an example of that earlier with the claims of American biological weapons research facilities on Bear Island, part of the Svalbard Archipelago. They could, of course, come up with news stories about the Norwegian government instituting some kinds of policies that restrict what ethnic Russians can do, or you know, they can claim that the Norwegian government in some way is oppressing ethnic Russians, whatever it would be. The second point that I want to make here is that this is an idea that Danish military analyst Anders Puck-Nielsen proposed, actually, and I have a citation if anyone is interested in that, and I can talk about it a little bit more if there are any questions. But this was a point which I found to be very insightful that he made regarding the possibility of Russia trying to trigger NATO Article 5 by attacking a remote region of a NATO country. So the example that he used actually was specifically referring to northern mainland Norway, which shares a very small border with Russia, or also Finland. So if Russia were to, for example, launch some small incursion into a very remote region of Finland or northern Norway, that could trigger Article 5. It would be an assault on the sovereign territory of a NATO member, and all of NATO would therefore be obliged to defend that country and to take actions against Russia. However, and if that were to happen, for example, to Poland or to any one of the Baltic states, right, that would likely be a significant enough attack to actually trigger a real major response from NATO. And that's the kind of scenario that I think a lot of people are focused on right now. What if Russia attacks the Baltic? What if Russia attacks Poland? If Russia, however, were to attack a very remote part of, say, Finland or Norway, it's harder to imagine a really decisive, firm response from all of NATO, particularly the United States, which is shrinking into increasing isolationism, or countries like Portugal and Spain, which are very far removed from the site of conflict. Harder to imagine them having a really firm and decisive reaction to Russia launching an assault on a very remote, very distant region, far away, that seems distant, that seems like it wouldn't really affect them. And if that were to happen, if Article 5 were to be triggered, if a NATO country were attacked and Article 5 were triggered, and NATO, particularly the United States, did not react, then it would essentially mark the end of NATO, right? The Article 5 would lose its legitimacy. It would lose its leverage or its power, if you will. So that is something that I think with Svalbard, of course, it's hard to say for sure whether this would happen, but it's a possibility that I think should also be considered. The final note that I want to make here about the sort of risk regarding Russian activity on Svalbard is that there's a Russian consulate on Svalbard, which is something of a counterintelligence concern for Norway and for NATO. Its embassies and consulates are quite often used as intelligence outposts for countries, especially for Russia, has quite a history of stationing intelligence officers and conducting intelligence operations out of their consulates and embassies. So having that in Svalbard, in a fairly important region of the Arctic, is, I would argue, a potential counterintelligence concern for NATO. Now switching over to Svalbard as a possible asset for NATO. So I mentioned earlier that I don't believe there's a major threat presently of Russia, for example, invading Svalbard, for example, or starting a full-blown war with all of NATO. And even if something like that did happen, I don't believe that Russia would be able to engage in the Arctic in quite as significant a way as some people might fear, particularly given the fact, or rather, as we might have thought, say, 5 years ago. Of course, one of the main issues for Russia is that their naval capabilities they were quite limited even before the war in Ukraine, but especially since the war in Ukraine. Their naval capabilities have been quite severely weakened. Of course, famously, they lost the Moskva down in the Black Sea, their Black Sea Fleet's flagship, as well as many other vessels that the Ukrainians have taken out. So in the short term, Russia does not pose a serious threat to Svalbard. In that, with that in mind, I don't believe that that means NATO should simply sit around and do nothing necessarily with Svalbard. If NATO were to readdress the 1920 treaty, which sort of handcuffs them in terms of what they can do because it forbids militarization. If NATO and if Norway in particular were to readdress that treaty and find a way to militarize Svalbard or seriously change their policy towards it, then NATO could more easily control those waters north of Svalbard, as I mentioned earlier, particularly in the long term, as those waters become more opened up and the ice caps recede. It would provide a base for improved intelligence collection and general monitoring of the Arctic, and it would provide something of a counterweight to Russia's Arctic base off in Franz Josef Land, the Nogurskaya air base. Another note that or another point that I want to make here with the potential use of Svalbard for NATO is that the more NATO invests into the Arctic, the more Russia will feel a need to itself invest into the Arctic. So NATO could potentially push Russia into a major spending war, right? If NATO is able to significantly strengthen its position in the north, Russia's going to feel pressure to push back against that and strengthen their own position in the north. And especially with the war going on in Ukraine, it would be quite difficult for Russia to do that successfully. And so therefore, they would have two bad options. They either increase their presence in the Arctic and therefore divert resources away from Ukraine and from the Baltic and Finland, for example, or they ignore the buildup of NATO's presence in the Arctic, and thereby they essentially cede what could in the future be a very major theater of geopolitics, and they reduce their own prestige. Now, there are several complicating factors that will need to be addressed with Svalbard. This is by no means an easy task, trying to simply walk in and set up an air base, for example, on Svalbard because of the 1920 treaty. The first thing that I will point out is that Svalbard is fundamentally sovereign Norwegian territory, so Norway should take the lead on any reevaluation of the treaty. This is not the kind of thing that the United States can step in and unilaterally decide that this is what we're going to do. A couple of other things to keep in mind. Firstly, the Arctic Council, which regulates, it includes all the Arctic nations, so the United States, Canada, Norway is among them, Denmark, and as well Russia is also a member of the Arctic Council. They regulate a lot of the activity that goes on in the Arctic. Their focus is largely on issues related to indigenous peoples in the Arctic, but undoubtedly something like this, the potential militarization of territory and rewriting of a treaty, would be the kind of thing that the Arctic Council would, at the very least, need to have a seat at the table whenever dealing with those negotiations. That further complicates the problem here because Russia, which is a signatory of that 1920 Spitsbergen Treaty, is also a member of the Arctic Council, and therefore we can expect that, of course, any attempt to renegotiate the treaty, rewrite the treaty, militarize Svalbard, Russia will be quick to shut down just like that. I don't necessarily think this is the kind of thing that NATO or Norway should view as a complete as a silver bullet. Essentially, it's not the kind of thing that should be treated as, oh well, if Russia's not okay with it, we can't do it. Obviously, Russia has itself violated the Spitsbergen Treaty. They did that in the past. They've also well, obviously that's among their many other violations of international treaties and norms and laws. And I would tend to argue that when faced with an adversary that tends to abrogate international treaties and norms and laws, NATO should take a somewhat more hawkish stance on Russia, and therefore be willing to consider conversations like these regarding reevaluating the Svalbard Treaty. Third point that I'll make on here, particularly timely news or timely point to be making, the current US administration has shown a fixation on acquiring Greenland. I wanted to bring up this point quickly because I think that having this discussion about Svalbard and trying to shift the focus in the Arctic away from Greenland is necessary right now. The conflict, the tension between the United States and Denmark and Greenland is it's undermining the unity between the United States and its Scandinavian allies. Therefore, I think that I find it unlikely that the U.S. administration would shift its attention over to Svalbard, at least in the near term. But this is another, simultaneously a complicating factor that makes it tricky to renegotiate Svalbard in any way, but also a reason why shifting the conversation over to Svalbard, I think, is a good thing, because it could potentially alleviate some of the tensions and encourage more cooperation between the United States and its Scandinavian allies. A couple of further readings that I have on here, some of these sources that I myself used for Svalbard and the Arctic. The first one is the article that I cited at the very beginning of this lecture presentation, High North and High Stakes, which has good information on Svalbard and the possibility of it becoming the new epicenter of tension in the Arctic. A couple of other articles on here about Russia's general activities in the Arctic. And then this final source here is the source from which I found the map depicting the military bases in the Arctic, both NATO bases as well as Russian bases. So this is my thank you page. I do have a couple of more things to put on here or to say in conclusion, but just some my email address if anyone is interested in reaching out to me. I'm of course more than happy to discuss this topic further. So in conclusion though, Svalbard is, because of its geographical location, its potential to control, let me come back to the map, make it easier to explain this. Because of its potential to monitor and control the northern waters of the Arctic Ocean, as well as its proximity to Russian military bases, specifically on Franz Josef Land, as well as the possible threat that Russia poses to Svalbard. My proposal, my purpose with setting out in this research was essentially to demonstrate that NATO should, at the very least, reevaluate Svalbard and start initiating discussions about renegotiating, reconsidering its policy towards Svalbard. The current treaty from 1920, which is in place, is, I believe, inadequate for the current situation, given the belligerence that Russia has shown towards all of its neighbors, as well as its clear abrogations of that 1920 treaty, both historically and today, and then more broadly also its general propensity for gray zone operations in the Arctic, and the potential for the Arctic region to become more geopolitically significant in the strategic long term. And again, coming back to this, that will essentially conclude my side of the lecture today. Again, this is my email address here if anybody is interested in contacting me or discussing this topic further. I am more than happy to do so. And again, the citations that I've used throughout here and the sources that I've used. Again, I'll be happy to provide those as well. But I'm going to now turn this over to Philip, and we can begin the Q&A session.
Thank you, Jacob. So yes, if anyone have any questions to Jacob, now is the right moment. What do we see in the Q&A section? Okay, email. Okay, Arina, so we will send you the links. I will forward your email address to Jacob, and he will send you. What's more?
Sure. Yeah.
Yes, and that's it from the. No, we have more. Okay, so we have a question from Jacob. Did you come across anything in your research regarding sustainment and or logistical challenges of military basing in the Arctic? Any insights into how this has been handled in the past or could be in the future?
Okay, sorry, could you repeat the first half of that question? You broke up a little bit on my info.
Did you come across anything in your research regarding sustainment and or logistical challenges of military basing in the Arctic?
Okay. That is an excellent question. I wasn't able to find good specific information on that, but that is an excellent point. Yeah, with obviously the long distances involved in the Arctic and the current relative lack of infrastructure there, yeah, logistics would be a very significant problem for NATO and Russia for that matter. Svalbard, given its location, is also a good potential hub that could be one of the potential uses of Svalbard for NATO is as a logistical point. Again, it's like I said, it's about 600 miles north of Norway and several hundred. I'm going to say, I don't have this number off the top of my head. I'd have to go and look back into my notes. Somewhere around 300, 400 miles east of Greenland. So for any long distance NATO operations going into the Arctic, those northern waters of the Arctic Ocean, again, as the water becomes more available, yeah, Svalbard could be a major logistical hub and a good sort of stopover base for military operations going farther into the north.
Okay, and we have next question from Arina Didriksen. You've touched on the marked nature of gray zone warfare and hybrid attacks, specifically the way the Russian Federation potentially disguises its military activity under ambiguous language within its doctrine. I am also concerned about the use of Svalbard to discredit the NATO alliance. Do you think there is a gap in how we are responding to hybrid threats like cyber attacks and cable cuts? I'm thinking about the recent activity in the Baltic, but also the January 2022 subsea cable cut to Svalbard.
Yeah, that's another really fantastic question. I wish I had more information to provide a really good developed answer on that. I would say that there are some gaps in terms of how NATO is responding to Russia. NATO generally has not done a very good job, for one thing, of calling Russia out on these attacks. There seems to be a generally, it seems that there's cyber and well, rather the hybrid attacks and the gray zone activities and the information warfare that Russia engages in seems to be fairly effective because there is quite a lot of ambiguity that the public in the West often expresses regarding who really did things, even though we can fairly confidently assess that it was the Russians who engaged in some kind of activity. So I think that's one of the main issues is the sort of, yeah, on the information side of things, NATO does need to be more forceful in calling out Russian activities with regards to, yeah, cyber attacks. Obviously, there was the assassination attempt recently on the CEO, I believe it was, of Rheinmetall, as well as you mentioned, the cable, the cable destruction, if you will, or the cable ripping in the Baltic. Yeah, I do think those are areas that NATO needs to focus on. Absolutely.
And the next question from Alex H is, wouldn't the US acquiring Greenland avoid the need for NATO to negotiate the treaty, allowing the US to control the area instead of relying on NATO to do something about it?
I don't know that the US acquiring Greenland would really be necessary. Denmark is a NATO ally. Denmark, of course, controls Greenland. We do have a military base in Greenland. It's more in the northwest, as I believe, or sort of north central coast of Greenland. I do think that Greenland, yeah, especially establishing military bases on the northern and northeastern coast of Greenland would be a good start in terms of sort of strengthening up, shoring up NATO's presence in the Arctic and extending our control over the northern part of the Arctic Ocean. Svalbard, however, is still, I don't think that it would entirely remove the need, or at the very least remove the value in militarizing Svalbard because of Svalbard's closer proximity to Russia.
Next question from Jenna Hotiker. Will Norway, being probably the wealthiest European nation and not part of EU but a NATO member, have any appetite to risk its ability to continue extracting its wealth from the North Sea, drilling, unless this specific ability is put at risk? In other words, will Norway choose to defend Svalbard unless they are put at risk of losing everything versus just the Svalbard?
Okay, that was a long one. So if I understand correctly, the question is, would Norway be even willing to consider militarizing Svalbard if they didn't see a major threat to their drilling in the North Sea? Did I understand that correctly?
I can read it once again. Will
Sure.
Norway, being probably the wealthiest European nation and not part of EU but a NATO member, have any appetite to risk its ability to continue extracting its wealth from the North Sea drilling unless this specific ability is put at risk? In other words, will Norway choose to defend Svalbard unless they are put at risk of losing everything versus just the Svalbard?
Okay, I think I get it. So like would Norway be willing to basically give up Svalbard to the Russians if they thought that it would be a way to sort of buy? Okay, yeah. That's a good question. I would certainly hope that Norway would recognize that Russia wouldn't stop with Svalbard. That I don't believe Svalbard could be used as a bargaining chip to protect Norway's other activities in the Arctic and in the North Sea. I can't make a good assessment as to whether or not Norway, the Norwegian government, how they would approach that that question. I'm not enough of an expert on the current sort of makeup of the Norwegian government or how they would approach that question. But yeah, I mean, I would say that Norway certainly should be of the mind that none of their territory could really be used as effectively as a bargaining chip with Russia.
And one more question from Ben Strong. What is going on with the underwater world? US, NATO, and Russian submarines have been cruising the coastline of Norway and the Arctic for a while.
Yeah, that's another good question. Yeah, again, I can't, unfortunately, I can't provide a great answer to that. I didn't cover very much with submarine research, submarine activities for my research on Svalbard. Um, I I would say that in the event of a conflict between NATO and Russia, certainly one of Russia's main strengths would be their submarine capability, and of course their naval doctrine in the Cold War called for, in the event of a war with NATO relying on large numbers of submarines to go out into the North Atlantic and wage convoy warfare, convoy interdiction against NATO ships transporting troops and supplies to from North America to Europe. So, yeah, I mean that's another reason why Svalbard could be potentially a good asset for NATO, because if NATO is able to establish some kind of some systems on Svalbard, as well as possibly, again, maybe a small naval presence there, particularly with anti-submarine vessels, they could potentially detect and neutralize Russian submarines on their way from large Arctic naval bases in places like Murmansk, trying to go out into the North Atlantic.
So we still have time for one more question related to the Svalbard Islands. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, then I would like to thank you, Jacob, and all of you who joined us today. For those interested in learning more about our courses and applying to study at IWP, visit us online at iwp.edu. Thank you again.
Thanks.